Buenos días para todos.
Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure uh, to have you here with us, accompanying us to exchange reflections on what we have called occasion 21st century uh, psychoanalysis still um, valid, and what does it consist in? But it's not just sharing for us, it's also establishing dialogue and why not arguing for our ideas. It is a different situation than we're used to. And I think that maybe some colleagues have not met us before. And so I will make a brief presentation of us conveners and then a little bit of history of our movement. The ones who convened this meeting, who are we? We convened a space that some years ago we called from Buenos Aires a return to Lacan. Norberto Ferreira, Isidoro Beck, and myself, Benjamin. Many colleagues in our institutions, uh, friend institutions in America, Uruguay, Brazil, and other countries have accompanied us all of these years. And now a little bit of history. Back in the 60s, and we're talking of another century, over 55 years ago, Buenos Aires started getting the very first texts, the first notions by Jacques Lacan. Even before his writings had been published, we started reading Lacan much before that in Buenos Aires, and also, why not, to convey and transmit and practice psychoanalysis in view of his notions, the notions the teacher gave us, conveyed to us. Some of us, at a certain point in time, were able to travel to Paris to meet him in person. However, our training has been through reading his texts, his seminars, and of course, our own clinical practice, our own analysis. So we're not improvised here. We come from far back. And I would like to point out that we were formed or educated, trained in the letter of Lacan and our own practice. Lacan's presence did not become an obstacle to his teaching. In the course of these years, we have founded Freudian schools following the Freudian School of Paris, basically. This foundation goes back to 1974. And it's a paradox, but it still is up. It endures. And we will turn 50 years of life in a few years. We have made known the works of Lacan in all of Latin America with our Latin American meetings or with Convergence in Europe. We have held Convergence Congresses, which it's a Lacanian movement for Freudian psychoanalysis, Convergence, that is. So there's books and conferences and seminars that we have authored. And now, what has led us to create this forum, this space that here in Buenos Aires we have dubbed a return to Lacan? As you know, Lacan died 40 years ago. Before he died, he dissolved the Freudian school in Paris. And his dissolution letter It's very interesting to read what his motivation was. And let me read a brief paragraph to remind you of what Lacan said back in January 5, 1980. His words: if he had not interposed himself, the School of Paris would have worked against the sense for which it was created. And he adds, this means that he founded the school for a work in Freud's field, re-establishing his truth, to bring the original practice that Freud called psychoanalysis to its duty that corresponds to it in our world, that may denounce with criticism any detours and deviations or concessions that slow down the progress. And for me, this objective is still valid. And for us, this objective still is valid. Some time ago, we started reading texts, he continues, of some disciples who have decidedly moved away from Lacan's teachings and um, denaturalizing the words and the function of the unconscious, not just Freud's unconscious, but the unconscious invented or reinvented by Lacan. And let me remind you that when he presented in Vincennes his clinical session, he says the unconscious is Lacan's, the field is Freudian. Some years ago, we met some who call themselves Lacanian, but just taking his latest seminars, setting aside all of his prior production. And very briefly, and I will come back to this is opting for counter psychoanalysis, not for psychoanalysis. And something of the same sort happened with post-Freudians who fixed themselves to the second topic, forgetting the unconscious. And this is how the psychology of ego and behaviorism came up, nothing to do with psychoanalysis. And then the English school fixed to the id and drives, and they were unable to differentiate drives from instincts and the id. And they again forgot about the unconscious that was deleted. Lacan does not set aside the ego or drives. He integrates them to the imaginary, the real, or the symbolic. Since 2014, 7 years ago, give or take, from Buenos Aires, our return to Lacan has has held 6 or 7 meetings a year. The pandemic is still here. Last year, it forced us to interrupt our face to face meetings. Today, thanks to the internet, we can take it up again, perhaps allowing us to disseminate our task more at large. We have 2 panels today. First, with our closest colleagues who have helped us collaborate with our own job or work. And this is why we're here today, to support psychoanalysis, uphold it in the 21st century, responding to the question, what does it consist in? Welcome all. Thank you very much. Okay, good morning. I'm Diego Fernandez. I'm a psychologist, a member of the Freudian Argentine School, and before my presentation of the first participants of this panel, I'd like to underscore a paragraph of the manifest of Return to Lacan, which says today the deviation of the analytic experience shows um, disdain for the word, refusal of the value of the unconscious and the structuring of the subject, supported in the unconfessed realities of the castration of the other, inhabiting in them, although they don't like it. Their practice uh, accompanies the countless attendance with the absence of listening and the takeoff of the self. We uh, follow Lacan in his saying there is jouissance with a practice that founds a jouissance. This was our manifest. I understand that this return to Lacan is returning to an ethics search in view of the deviations produced by marketing, the market, and communication nowadays. And this return is necessary not only because of our manifest, but also for the hundreds of publications of certain influencers who, in the name of psychoanalysis, embellish it with marketing and other stuff, confusing the necessary sensitivity to do discourse with gratuity, with just following words in a screen without the presence of the body, without the potential interrogation of the psychoanalysis. Analysis. And this causes disorientation in the young who come to us looking for reference, but they find infatuation. And they say, you don't need to be analyzed in order to become an analyst. Okay, that's it. And now I will introduce the members of the panel. I wish to thank the three of them for having volunteered to coordinate. Ana Lucia Falcao, Santiago Deus, Anabel Salafia, and Ursula Kirsch will be the panel speakers. Santiago Deus is the first. He's a psychoanalyst from the School of Buenos Aires. He teaches seminars, has authored several publications, also a book about to be published. He's a participant of the Latin American reunion and of conversions. And now we uh, will give the floor to him. Thank you, Santiago. It is a pleasure for me to be here. It's a true honor to accompany the convening masters and also share this panel with prestigious analysts, very renowned. The policy of symptom and the right to respect. Freud wrote The Psychology of Masses in 1921, talking about the complex mechanisms of identifications, being lucid about identification to the leader and submission to masses. One of the most sinister chapters happened after this, Hitler in power. After this text, Lacan teaches his third conference, which then became a written text. The approach by Lacan was not the dangers of the emergence of a new leader. His concern has to do with the advent of the real, he calls it. At this time, he talks about a runaway real that has the support of science, a real that may become aggressive and sweep through the globe, par lettre included. It is identified with a devouring jouissance in the subject, an oral drive in its fullest expression. He finds here his destructive potential at the time where it becomes connected with science without limits in a capitalistic time that is stark. This is Lacan imagining a real invasive mm, real, and thinking of the religious mantis that devours his partner, her partner after copulation. The specular image, the sensation before the need of the other may be annihilating, and this causes anguish. Another imaginary border of the real is the crocodile in the reverse of psychoanalysis. It talks about the disaster of maternal desire and a crocodile that may gulp down his young. Lacan resorts to the stick in the mouth of a crocodile, making it impossible for the mouth to be closed. These prehistoric animals gulp down without swallowing really the eggs of their young to take them to the water and find more females. The next example is Lacan in his third. It's not a crocodile or a giant image. It's just a little fish, a very voracious one that gulps down sense until it bursts. Again, the oral drive. The scientific and religious discourse says at the time of his conference that they find sense in everything, even in monstrous things, Lacan says. It is then, 50 years afterwards, after the psychology of the masses, the advent of the real is called the effect of a runaway jouissance as an attempt to obturate because of hunger. Science provides its own equations and inventions, the radio and artificial, all the way to artificial intelligence, from what is anecdotic or from an antibiotic to superbacteria that resist everything. This is identified with the jouissance of par lettre. And Lacan sees this, warns about this. We have to avoid being dominated by robots and bacteria infecting everything. In Ray Bradbury's The Prairie, 1950, Lydia talks to her husband regarding the electronic happy home that they had, or house that they had built. I thought we had built it, she says, to do nothing, but nothing is horrible because we have nothing to do here and we have no authority on our own children. So the protagonist experiment the worst symptoms. Like today, they are controlled by the machines they created. They live in apathy and they have lost all affection for their children or effective contact for them. What kind of a life is that? The author, it's science fiction, but what world is it describing? It's in the African prairie where the wilderness and desertion exists. And of course, this statement is unfair for the complex Africa, but it is a part of its geography. Going back to Lacan, when he says that jouissance of being eaten, despite that, we will not be able to make it not a symptom. Like saying you won't manage it. It's a little bit pessimistic about the advent of the real and par lettre, but he goes on defending psychoanalysis as the best option to defend the advent of real, and the response to the symptom depends on where the analyst positions itself. The policy of symptom puts the brakes on, it acts as a um, stick in the mouth of a crocodile. And this applies both for the intention of analysis when we see these runaway jouissances on the couches, or also we see it in view of the present dilemmas in the youth. Lacan in the third draws the Borromean knot and the registry of real in the intersection with the imaginary, describes the jouissance of the other, and he moves from science to life. That's why the question is, what kind of a life is this? The next year in some Tom, it's the enjoying of the other, of the barred other. What kind of a life is this of science trying to cover the lack, obturate the sexual relation, and use the enjoyment of the other? Psychoanalysis, he says, it's a different kind of discourse and needs to counter this saturation. When this chaos advances, the real comes as a symptom to make it impossible for whatever it is, but it is an event that is real. In the third function, in his seminar, he talks about the lack and the barriers to enjoyment. Lacan, uh, following the Arab proverb, mentions four things that do not leave traces. The life of the woman with no traces of the phallic, but all of a sudden he has a lapsus, a slip, and he finds something that doesn't leave a trace. The person who exchanges money, and that doesn't leave any traces. Those are two different modes. In view of the precluded, that leaves no traces, the role of venereal diseases is not by chance that it happens in the structure. So the psychoanalyst places himself in the place of lack and makes the object operational. He becomes an object A, cause for desire. In Nice 1974, Lacan says that in the bottom of the swirl, what makes a cause is a mm, rejection, and an analyst has a right to be analyzed or to be an analyst if he has realized this. He has to assume his position of refusal or rejection, um, in order to analyze the analysis. And uh, this, to refer to what was said before, that some analysts think that they don't need to be analyzed in order to be analysts. And Lacan concludes that the analyst should not believe he is too much, but what then to believe in. This is where the policy of St. Tom starts, and a life where the program is tending to preserve the lack in order to become a cause for the residue, for something that has been used. And but what is left after that is maybe used again if processed correctly. And civilization today knows that it is mandatory to recycle this uh, waste. And Silvia Amigo has said that the object A that drops as a result of analysis falls ahead, and it fertilizes, gives lives in connection with desire. What has happened with desire? The analyst that knows how to analyze, he knows that he was a waste. It's analysts who can tell others how to prevent this from happening. Logics and discourse of the all do not cause or fertilize. They cover up, and they become super egotist. Uh, On the other hand, the other option is the subject going through the not all, completing the field of the other, becoming operational to cause a desire and preserve and recreate, thus, the lack. In this manner, having a right is ethical, not moral. At the same, or in the same years, Lacan talks about a specific confusion that he calls the function of the father and of the symptom. And the function is knotting and maintaining together the real, symbolic, and imaginary in the Borromean knot, as well as making a whole that makes it possible to fit it in an unsaturated fashion. Talking of the father, he says that he will have a right to respect and perhaps love or maybe not love. It's desire around the object A and the respect of love. I have talked about a function that produces an intervention, maintaining repression where it should be, not too much, exactly where it should be. And we may remember that in Freud, in his 34th conference, he said that as analysts, in view of the drive, we navigate among two storms, Charybdis and Scylla. Scylla of excess and repression, and the contrary, an excess of permissivity. Now, time is up, Santiago. Yes, I'm about to finish. The symptom, he says in RCI, operates widely. Eh, The analysis should soften this, make it milder, and but with the symptom, and Lacan says this when talking about runaway jouissance, he talks about around the symptom coming from the real and the possibility of the analyst to decipher this. It's better to believe the real event that believing in the totalizing discourse of science or trying to look for the woman with capital W, which is the case of the neurotic, believing there, but not believing her or it. Symptom is an event of the real that may evoke another presence, the doubt of the analyst to reduce it with equivocals. This is the utilization of life in the sense that Lacan gives it. We operate from analysis to uh, make it real. And it is this that he means to move into, to tie the three and to knot them up in order to bring them together, but also keeping them identifiable. This is the hope in the short term. There's nothing else. And this is not something to be set aside. Thank you.
Thank you, Santiago. Ana Lucia Falcao will now take the floor. Psychoanalyst, a member of the Association of Analysis of Brazil, one of the conveners for the Latin American Lacan meeting. Good morning, everybody. I am very happy to be with you. Being so close, despite the fact that we are so far away, I will start reading my works called Psychoanalysis and Pandemic. From the last years, we have been surprisingly impacted by the presence of coronavirus, whose consequence was the pandemic. In some countries, very especially, apart from the presence of COVID 19, a chaotic status took place. A second was also mortal virus, the lack of governance, lack of heading, and neglect for healthcare, prevention, vaccines, the use of masks, and social distance. Some leaders deny the disease and mock it. They call to not complying with the rules and not preventing contagion. We cannot hear Ana Luisa anymore. I'll start again then. I turned my microphone off. I'm so sorry. Ana Luisa says. Some leaders deny disease and mock it, and they prompt people not to comply with the rules to prevent contagion. We witness with surprise and lack of understanding The position of these leaders that showed some assumed and unknown superiority in relation to this disease, something so new for scientific studies and all of us, would challenge the attitude of these leaders to the mass. What is the origin of this? Lack of castration, this identification. This word, this identification, was brought to me by a psychoanalyst colleague, and since that time she used this word, it caught my eye. Against the invisible virus, we have few resources, no available medications, and some hypotheses. We limit ourselves to taking care somehow, rules and protocols to follow. Socially, it is in the relationship with one another where we can act. But against the virus of lack of governance, it's very hard during the pandemic to react in a safe and efficient manner, an effective manner. The number of dead people is growing by the day in Brazil. Before this virus, we are all the same and we have few barriers to protect ourselves. We are living in the impossibility of approaching the sick and fulfilling the stages of mourning, uh, taking the dead to the ground, participating in funerals, etc. Of the dead, frequently we just have the memories. Therefore, the possibility of symbolization is becoming more and more scarce with a lack of stages to be followed. Death appears in an anticipated manner. It's not dealing with death as something that will happen one day in a somehow distant future for each one of us, but its presence is imminent, constant, and threatening. In this sense, discomfort sets in approach, and the meeting of the bodies creates suspicion and pops up like a threat, a possibility of transmission, contagion, isolation, social distance. Cleaning are the protocols to survive. Based on that, a question arises: how to escape earlier death? This absolute lady whom we know and are imaginary only. It is necessary for the drive of life to be interwoven to the drive of death, and for the drive of death not to stand out, not to detach from it, becoming autonomous, promoting the destruction of the order of what is real, such as Santiago has just mentioned. People sometimes repeat the attitudes of leaders who do not abide by the protocols, searching for protection. People identify with them and jump into an almost suicidal behavior because it may prompt contagion and consequently death. Peril is not individual but collective. Psychoanalysis is a possible treatment for symptoms, phobia, anguish, delusions, panic, neurosis, and aims at each one for their singularity and own story. It explains the possibility that the analysand leaves his or her position of just a mere effect of the significant chain, in jail, a slave of a position of total submission. I don't know how to say this in Spanish, but in Brazil we use this word as if the mass of people, by following their leaders, leaders that are not concerned about promoting identification, that mass we call gado, meaning cattle, as if it were a group of animals. They don't think. So, in psychoanalysis, that movement of deconstructing, reconstructing, untying, retying some differently, using a substitute, trying to rearticulate unknown symptoma are possibilities provided by analysis. The desire of the analyst, always hand in hand with questioning, is the quid of the issue. When it is about the election of the profession, of the career, what is important is the decision based on identification and idealization. But on the contrary, the desire of being an analyst is not shown as something in the conscious of the being. Goods and morale. She had turned on off her microphone and starts again. The identification and idealization is not what is in the basis of the desire to become an analyst. Lacan always highlighted the identification of the analyst and the analyst as the purpose of the analysis, and highlighted that this identification is the beginning of the analysis rather than its end. The analysis, the desire that counts and is part of the cause, is just one, and it is on the side of the analyst rather than the analyst. But it will depend on the analyst, his or her desire, the whole process to happen or not. What sense would it make the analyst's desire in this process? The analyst has a desire, but it is not his or her singular desire part of the cause. After a serious and lengthy analysis, the analyst is not does not lack desire or unconscious. Desires are always infantile, unconscious, and indestructible. Freud reminds us, the analyst, for the experience of his or her own analysis, finds a new way to deal with his or her unconscious as a way to acknowledge this desire. It is one of the aspects of his or her knowing how to do things that operates in the process. And so when the analyst lets an analysand go, he or she is resisting their function or is implied in that. These are the blind points about which Freud told us about, and which in Lacan would become what the analyst's desire did not work. It was not possible to be an operator in this case. The analyst's desire is for the analysis to take place, for the analyst to come to talk. The analyst delivers the means so that the analyst can repeat in the relationship with him or her the need of the drive, the reality of the unconscious. But we have to pay attention. Anything that intervenes by suspending, destroying, or interrupting continuity of treatment is the analyst's resistance. At times of pandemic, then, psychoanalysis, as usual, is creative and adjusts itself to the means it has available. The internet, telephone, WhatsApp, email, Skype, etc. The different platforms. The impossibility of the analyst to accept this means proves to be resistance. Depending on each case, context, and structure in the analysis session, the voice and the gaze can be privileged to prompt the talk and for the analysis to take place. It is the way that we have to hold on to the treatment. And a session was interesting with a 9-year-old girl, and throughout the session she played and had fun spontaneously with the image, connected and disconnected the video, came up and away. So she brought this game with the image that looks like our Fort Da, which we all know. Likewise, at the time of eclosion of the pandemic, Psychoanalysis has to offer itself as a way to receive and to listen to human suffering in these dark times. That's it. My presentation is over. I think I have talked about power, about inserting psychoanalysis, and using what technology offers to us to make these processes of analysis to take place. So that analysts may articulate and talk about anguish and suffering and about their symptoms as well, so that we can all work on them, even when not face to face. I believe that I've learned a lot, that we can work and analyze and conduct the analysis even without the physical presence. But the gaze is there and the voice is there. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ana Lucia. Quería informarles que para los que quieran ir haciendo preguntas en cualquiera de los idiomas,
I would like to tell you that those who wish to ask questions may do so in the chat. Probably we won't be answering all of them, but now we will listen to Ursula Kirsch, a psychoanalyst who is a member of the Freudian School of Argentina. Since 1989, he was designated AME for the school in 1992 and nominated AE between 2005 and 2008. She's a member of the foundation board. Good morning. In the first place, I'd like to thank Benjamin Dom, Isidro Beck, and Norberto Ferreira for their invitation to participate in this meeting. And I would like for you to consider the topic of the invitation, 21st century validity of psychoanalysis, and what does it consist in. And as you see, it is not asking whether it is still valid, but the question wants to know what it is made of, what that validity is made of. It is not always that psychoanalysis is valid. It earns its validity if a question is maintained. It is the specific function of a question. And I'd like to invite you to go into that function. The function is a need, and that need is present in Lacan's teaching. In his seminar about the four fundamental psychoanalytical notions, he asks, what order of truth does our practice generate? And he poses that there is an order of truth, and that our practice, however, should generate another one, a different one from the existing one. Maybe there is no order. Now, in so asking, he makes way for this order of truth. The Noemi Sirota recently said that the analyst's discourse interrogates itself. This this turn, is a condition for the discourse to exist. The analyst could not tell his entering into discourse if he did not interrogate himself. His entry in the discourse is not assured. It resonates of another. Was there an analysis? And this is the question that keeps coming back to the analyst after each session. Is it a question about knowledge? In the science versus psychoanalysis discussion, what do each other consider knowledge? Where science states, psychoanalysis asks. If we start with Descartes, we see where the certainty of knowledge lies. I think, then I am. And so, as to establish this, he clearly sets aside the question of truth, thus identifying knowledge with the real. In progressing, science perfects knowledge. It identifies the real with the number, but the incidence of the real in knowledge is only seen if coupled with truth, if it comes together. Which knowledge counts in psychoanalysis? The analysis takes up that anomalous knowledge set aside by Descartes, and by pursuing it, it discovers a truth. That knowledge is missing a subject. What does Freud do? Well, with the invisible saber of his penmanship, he cuts the heavens of the science in his time. In one trace, he spells that even though there are thoughts in dreams or conclusions, it is only an appearance of thinking. It only seems a thought. The alternative, called disjunction in logics, either this or that, is crucial for a subject to be able to place the avatars of his desire. And it takes the form of an enumeration in the dream, as if each argument had equal rights. To remember Irma's dream, it's Freud's dream in his interpretation of dreams, we see that he realizes that either Irma is resisting, or her sexuality is unsatisfactory, or the cause is organic. It is only when he hears, when he tells the dream, he realizes that it's not trivial. The serious, the enumeration is not trivial. It's excluding one thing or the other. And those three things enable a fourth thing announced because it's missing. What is the dreamer's involvement in Irma's ailments? Psychoanalysis subverts the Cartesian formula, showing that the subject, in his subjective relation, alienates the relation of his desire with reality in an excluding disjunction. I either think or I am not. This disjunction needs be interrogated in order to find its fallacy and unveil another order of truth. The knowledge displayed in analysis takes place in the realm of words. Its dimensions are symbolic and imaginary. The real is excluded. Where is it? It's excluded. That the subject is missing in knowledge is a marking of the real. The analyst knows that he is excluded from this real, but being excluded specifies his relation to the real. It makes the real his major reference. It is not the number that is real. Rather, it is real that the real is outside. The number bespeaks this incidence, as happens, for example, with repetition. This incidence of the real only appears if the question is maintained. The way in which the subject disappears in the subjective relation with the others creates the need for a place where that which results may be transferred. Thus, the analysis is the object of this transference, Lacan says in his Seminar 11. But only insofar as the analysis is constituted as a new social bond. This social bond or tie will be new if it allows interrogating itself. What emerges is an unexplored field. What happened or did not happen with the others only emanates its power as long as it signifies. Thus, as a drive, it insists. and as a desire, it demands. But the essential for the advent of the subject is not this signification, but that the subject should see to what senseless, relentless, traumatic signifier he is subjected as a subject. Seminar 11. The subject is subject to this ripping, this tear between what is acting in him and that which he didn't know. In the sense, nonsense displayed by this signification, a reference is beating. The relation of inhibition with anguish affords us a clue. Inhibition poses to anguish the enigma of its cause. Is it that I cannot move because I'm anguished? Or is it that I'm anguished because of what not moving means? The real is introduced in the structure, completely veiled by a signification that covers it. The analyst supposes a subject in that he listens. The supposition is not a question in itself, but it makes way for it. Whoever is being analyzed there finds no other way to dare say something that may be affected by a real that by supposing the existence of a love, investing the analyst as a subject supposed to know. The analysand supposes the analyst has a knowledge about what afflicts him, but keeps to himself the relation of that pain with his truth. The more he idealizes the analyst, the more he fears that the analyst is deluding himself. In order to escape this trap, the analyst asks, has there been an analysis after each session? The interpretation aims at having emerged the repetition of that senseless, relentless, traumatic signifier, which continues to stay identical in that difference in order to screen in the field of words the persistence of an object, which Lacan calls object little a, which causes desire and covers the truth of the subject. Unlike science, which starts with the object, psychoanalysis discovers it. The body of all the developments and demonstrations of science equals, Lacan says, in a subjective relation, what he has called the object small a. An object that bears jouissance right there, where it's all about desire. The analysis has the demand for love pass on to a demand which is articulated in grammatical tenses with those with which the drive contours the object. This implies an operation in the analysand that has to do with the fact that the desire belongs with the subject, and this encounter with an object which embodies his desire puts to the test the validity of psychoanalysis. The analysand takes ownership of the question and says, and who are you, to the analyst? If that suppose knowledge I thought you had, you don't really have because it's now mine. And in so asking, he departs from the analyst as subject supposed to know, but also he departs from the imperative of signification. If as desire is lack, because he can't respond other than with the drive, he now discovers the incapacity of all signification to cover, to cloak what has what happens with sex. And at the signification level, language fails. It narrows the relationship between the sexes, as he says in seminar 14. You have 2 minutes, Ursula. Consequently, the analysand accesses the truth of structure at that point where truth claims its right, which in a subjective relation, the fact of the sex confronts each one equally with that unknown real, with that impossible to exhaust real, which is the real of sex. Seminar 12. So not always is psychoanalysis valid. It earns the validity if the question is maintained. It is all about the specific function of a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. Now, Annabel Salafia will take the floor, a psychoanalyst, founding member of the Freudian School of Argentina in 1974, together with Oscar Mazota and others, IME of the Argentinian Freudian School, co-founder and VP of the Lacanian field in 1991, a member of the European Foundation for Psychoanalysis, where she has taught a number of courses and seminars, part of the Scientific Council of the magazine Rules of Psychoanalyst Sparse Analytic. She teaches the school seminar to enter psychoanalysis. This course of the Freudian School of Argentina has authored the Easy and Need of this course books, Practice of Psychoanalysis, The Failure of Denial, folders of Teaching Psychoanalysis 1 of 2, What Desire Is 1 and 2, and other books in cooperation with other authors. Annabel, you have the floor. Good morning. Thank you, Diego, for the introduction. In the first place, I would like to thank Benjamin Dom, Norberto Ferreira, and Isidoro Vey for the invitation to be part of this activity. I think we should call this an event which is taking place because of this creation, the space return to Lacan. It's not the first time I am involved with this space. I believe that the previous time was in 2019. I also think it was in March. And I have always found this an interesting and fruitful activity. I understand return to Lacan, the invitation to go back to Lacan as the purpose of going to the most fruitful times of his teachings. So today I'm going to talk about that Lacan introduces in psychoanalysis, the creation of the concept and its association with the function of failure, of lack, and also about the validity of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is not epistemology. This means the creation of a concept in psychoanalysis takes place in its praxis, and it is a fact created as a concept in the experience of cure itself. Having said this, this does not prevent a theory of anguish with certain invariants, one of which is its relation to lack, one to the real, and the fact of becoming the subjective translation, as it was said, of object A, which implies that there are certain significance that frame, and let me highlight this term, frame the existence of anguish. I'm going to talk about this concept in the field of experience, the concept of anguish, because It is because of its purpose that there is a strong relationship between the concept and the praxis which drives to the creation of this concept. Making anguish a concept is, in fact, a proposal by Kierkegaard. Even his work, Lacan celebrates it and to a certain extent picks up the glove, this developing of anguish as a concept. For Kierkegaard, or such as Hegel says, with whom Kierkegaard is discussing this, there needs to be a function of the concept in an actual connection to what is real. That is Kierkegaard's position. Hegel's position, excuse myself. But Kierkegaard says that anguish will only give us a final apprehension of what is real. Anguish will reveal itself as very important in relation to what Lacan calls many times throughout his seminars, the irreducible object A, which is not an object, it is a letter. And if we want to conceive it as an object, we have to conceive it an object made of lack of something. This irreducible object, Lacan says, has to be sufficiently integrated to what he calls the desire of the analyst. The analyst, for some bias, some edge, brings his or her desire back to that irreducible A in a degree enough, and this is the nut of the issue, to offer it to the question of anguish a real guarantee. Is anguish then a subjective question? As it was just said, Lacan talks about anguish as a subjective translation of object A, but we may ask, if anguish is subjective, which for the function of object A has a relationship with what is real, this subjective function becomes a way of connecting with what is real in analysis. If we're talking about the statute of affection and analysis, anguish, Lacan will say, is affection by definition, or the singular name of the plural of affections, such as emotion, pregnancy, etc. The analyst builds a concept of anguish from the position to which he or she is driven, the fact of saying something said or not said by the analyst. And the analyst and dictates, we may say, the semblant that the object of the drive takes the analyst and determines the place from which he or she listens. So he or she will be voice, gaze, the chest, feces at different times in the analysis or even in a session. The four objects, the voice, the gaze, the chest, or the feces, a substitute for the big other. There is no direct relationship between the subject and the big other. There is no access to that dimension or those dimensions of the other in analysis other than from the object. That is to say, anguish, what anguish is. The four objects are replacements for the big other, as we said, but this is to the extent that object A is asexual, as determined as such, functional objects. Also, they are called partial objects. In fact, time will go by as object A appears, which takes its more effective function when we talk about anguish. And in this seminar, time will go by from the time when the object appears for Lacan to call it asexual, because it's not an object but a function of the lack between the significant and the body and the drive. There would have not been a concept of anguish if Lacan had not discovered from the experience with the mirror and the different experiences with the mirror, the optical scheme, the Daniel Lagache report, a beyond of the specular image, and some element that cannot be uh, mirrored. This element makes to the need of the invention of the so-called object A. What can separate the A from the IA is the ideal I, the image is where the economy of jouissance gets into the body. The body, in association to narcissism, is an object. That's why Lacan writes IA, living what is sinister, the phenomenon of the double of the El Horla by Maupassant is what we call an effect of the invasion by the specular object. That is to say, that not element that cannot be mirrored is the condition of a normal specularity. What do I mean by that? That it's not a good word, let me tell you, a fortunate word, but I need to use it now. This peculiarity that lets you acknowledge your image, recognize your image in the mirror. This means that if the object that cannot be mirrored, that is in the mirror but we cannot see it, if this object is part of the image in the mirror, I mean, if the image in the mirror has a part like this, the subject does not recognize himself or herself in the mirror. It's something with to do with schizophrenia, but there are accidents from which there is this failure of that cannot be mirrored, that prevents the recognition of your own image in the mirror, and that can be an accident at a certain point in time, something temporary. Still, it's always interesting to detect what uh, happens with this, why this takes place. Lacan takes different roads in trying to explain the existence of anguish as from what the clinical practice teaches. In the first place, we need to see that in any demand, there's something deceitful in relation to that which keeps the place of desire. What causes anguish is the outcome of that has been filled, the false demand. The place of the vacuum to be kept has been occupied. The A, Lacan would say, to write the formulation of demand and drive, which is also the phantasmatic structure in neurotic, which is supported by demand and drive. This formulation supports this. The other formulation where the scratched subject, the phantom, supports the desire. But in the analysis, the phantom is manifested in terms of demand. I was saying it is a trap of the phantasmatic structure in the neurotic, which supports conceiving the drive. Without that, well, it's not an instant because this is lost for the speaker. Without that, we would not have the concept of drive, Freud writes. So we're talking about oral demand, anal demand. Both in one case and the other, the object, feces, or the chest are the outcome of a cutting point symbolized by and together with the losange in the game of structure of The scribing of demand and drive, which in the neurotic has the function of phantom or better phantasmatic trap. Anguish has a determining function in our practice, and that is due to the fact that ourselves as analysts provoke this, and anguish responds. What I have just said may be surprising, but as we develop this point, we will see the need to present it this way. Why does the analyst, his or her presence, would cause anguish? If it weren't for being in the place of the semblant of an object made of lack, as we said, as a function of semblant of an object that is lacking in the other one, being the last one pure significant. We can say that the presence of the analyst provokes anguish as his or her place is the place of the big other, and so returns to the subject the famous question, what do you want? In truth, to the extent object, and as we move on in Lacan's teachings, the presence of the analyst causes anguish as he or she is in the place of a semblant which is made of a lack. So object A in the shape of driving objects is precisely which is not significant and has to do with the entrance of the body into this economy. This lack in the other is what makes us talk. So when this lack is not there, we cannot talk. Anguish is not a signal that something may be lacking, but the default, the lack, that is the word Lacan uses, default, this is that the lack of support, of this support of the lack. And Lacan talks about monk. In Spanish, we say the lack of the lack, but it is a deficiency of the support of the lack, which is in the foundation of what we consider trauma. We can consider trauma right now from something that appears to us very current in relation to anguish. The fact that anguish has been, and it is Freud who tells us, Lacan says, chosen as a signal of something, isn't it that we should acknowledge the essential trace of this radical intrusion, so different from human livings who are alive and have become part of the atmosphere, something essential for the human being in the world where he or she has to breathe, suffocated, asphyxiated by trauma. There is no other trauma than birth. There is a major development by Lacan in relation to analysis itself as an artificial lung that helps us breathe. Analysis right now as that lung in relation to trauma, the trauma implied from going to an atmosphere where we cannot breathe. And that is a major point. Thank you very much. Your time is up. Yes, my time is up. Thank you very much for listening.
Muchas gracias, Anabel. Bueno.
Thank you, Annabelle. And now, while we get settled, we'll have a 15-minute time for Q&A. And I will read 3 questions while we get others. The first question is by Leona Wolf, and it's for Ana Lucia. The ascent of discourse course, that interdict desire as the Bolsonaro sex policy may be understood as a reinforcement of social castration in the return of the primordial father.
Ana Lucia, voy a hacer 3 preguntas.
She asked for the repetition of the question, but Diego says he will read the 3 questions. Alba Hitler asks also Ana Lucia and Santiago, where they say the enjoyment of the leader is real, but how to read the predisposition of some analysts to promote the mass within the realm of psychoanalysis. And now a question for Ursula. Can you expand on the intervention of the analyst in connection with how the grammatical tense of the drive contours the object? So we will respond those 3.
Em relação ao líder,
¿Cuál?
Diego, could you please repeat the question in relation to the leader? The first question, would you please repeat it? The reader's jouissance is for real, but how do we read some analysts' tendency to promoting the mass in the environment of psychoanalysis? If anyone would like to take the floor and start answering, Ana Lucia, Santiago, or Ursula?
do líder
I believe that the enjoyment of the leader's choices that we look at and we find explicitly today, has some real part to it. Yes.
possibilidade de se
And
defender
the subservience of the mass, the impossibility of defending itself from this mortal jouissance. Now talking about psychoanalysts and the mass, I didn't understand the question actually. What is the articulation of some psychoanalysts with the mass?
Na verdade, agora,
Thinking a bit more deeply, I think there is a relationship between the psychoanalyst and the mass. Maybe some
grande público
millennials that have conferences for major audiences, something different from what we expect. That is what I thought.
Sí, sí, tome la palabra porque...
Coincido con lo que decía Ana Lucia y agradezco
I
a
agree
Álvaro.
with what Ana Lucia was saying, and I thank the for give thanks for the question. I think it's a countersense altogether for the master analyst because Lacan, when he reads the Freud event, and also Annabella was talking about the event, and Lacan talks about the Freud event. When he says psychoanalysis is a symptom, the analyst himself is a symptom of civilization. A master analyst is contrary to sense. The master of our day is marketing science and how that comes into our daily practice. We see how we deny the lack and the problem that that causes. And I think the analyst is needed because of the symptom that comes from the real, havocing real. Thank you, Santiago. Let me answer or try to answer the question from Lou Lemos in connection with demand. There is a structural relationship between demand and drive. In this sense, grammatical tenses are the manner in which it is manifested. That is what we say. The drive and their destination, I mean. The demand is a complaint, yes, but it's a complaint directed to an other. Do something to the other, a first tense. The second tense would be making yourselves, depending on what that answer was, in order to come to the third moment, which is making the other do, the new subject do. So this means that in specifying the demand and what it produces, we see the advent of that which supports demand, which is desire. Desire, which is what we have at hand in the language, what translates into language the drive. Thank you, Ursula. Liliana Aguirre has a question for Annabelle Salafia. Can you expand on what the presence of the analyst causes in connection with the appearance of anguish? And there's an additional question on how to articulate the function of semblant in the question of you love me. Both for you, Annabelle. I will try to be brief in my answer. I will need to explain a little bit further what I said in an abridged fashion because of my time assignment or allocation. The presence of the analyst causes anguish in the first place insofar as the analyst is a part of the notion of unconscious. This is why the notion is essential, in my view, because the notion or the concept of an epistemological notion, the analyst is a part of that because it's no longer epistemological. It's part of the concept of unconscious. And there is the fact itself. The unconscious has a place for the analyst. But this place reserved to the analyst, which is represented because the analyst is the support for the lack in the subject, a lack unknown to the subject. The subject doesn't know how to recover that lack because it's in doing that that he will be able to do something. So the anguish caused by the presence of the analyst has to do with what it entails. There is something at play in the unconscious that comes in the form of that question, the question that Lacan poses in the graph of desire, with a question of the other going back on the subject. That is a question that is somewhat sinister, a question coming from the other to interrogate as to what do you want. That's one of the dimensions of the other that comes to play in analysis. There's two more: the dimension of the desire of the other, the dimension of enjoyment in the other, and the fact that the analyst is in this position and has to do with what the other, that is the set of signifiers, the other A that lacks and cannot come in. So it comes in to preserve the fact that of something that is not significant, and that other that is not signifier enters in the other. It's the possibility in the analytical session to establish a relationship between anguish and the real. The analyst provokes this anguish. This is, of course, another level of the question, but it causes the anguish because he is in the place of a pulsional object. The voice, the look, the regard, which is part of the analysis that frames the analysis, which is permanently at stake. And then there is this pulsional objects like uh, the vices that are objects. Because Lacan says, can you round up, please? The analyst is only semblant, that is, he functions as or is allowing the object to take him over. Two questions for Ana Lucia now. Patricia Dahl asks Ana Lucia about disidentification, and Liliana Donsis, also for Ana Lucia, asks whether identification with the ideal also causes segregation. Or can you say something else about that, Ana Lucia?
Thank you so much for the questions. I'm going to ask you to repeat the first question. Oh, the identification, right. I believe,
como eu disse, de uma psicanalista que ela
I heard this word from a psychoanalyst who put together a paper on this, and I kept it in my head, and I started to articulate this moment we're going through in Brazil, where there is a huge number of deaths. It's horrible. And there is a leader who says this is not happening. Nothing happens. Why is it that you are crying? What's the reason you are crying about? This stupidity in Brazil is like saying, stop the nonsense. So I try to understand that attitude, and sometimes I think of the de-identification with the population, with the mass, with a human being. There is an identification with the family, with your relatives. And out of that, anything else is part of the de-identification process. I loved this word because I can only understand leadership or a leader
como sendo uma desidentificação, uma não identificação.
I think that this lack of giving value of these deaths is like he's de-identifying himself from these people. I don't know where there is an identification. Maybe there is an identification with the majority, with a Hitler or a Mussolini. I don't understand. I don't know. What are we going through? I try to understand these forms. And Liliana's question was, oh, the ideal provokes segregation as well.
Pergunta difícil.
I can't answer that. Your question is very difficult. I would need to think longer to give you an answer, an honest answer. I don't quite know whether identification with the ideal promotes segregation. I'm a prisoner. I'm concerned about what we're living. It is very hard. So we try to think and understand to see whether this can improve. Talking and thinking of these things, because we can see that population are engaged in servitude, a very servant-like identification. It's as if people were handing themselves over to death. This is very hard. Thank you for your question. Given the time, we will finish this table. I would like to thank the participants a lot, because this is very important to keep on thinking, keep on working. Let me clarify that some questions that were not answered in YouTube's chat will be responded in our webpage, Return to Lacan from Buenos Aires. Retornoalacan.com is the website, and I would like to thank Santiago Deus, Ana Lucia Farcao, Ursula Kirsch, and Annabel Sarafia for their very good work. And now we'll take a couple of minutes break, and we will restart with the next table. Greetings. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
De Anabel Salar.
Adelante, Graciela.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Voy a empezar con una pregunta. ¿Quién presenta al presentador?
I have a question. I'm Graciela Jasinar, an analyst and member of the Freudian School of Buenos Aires, and I thank you for having invited me to coordinate this space. I thank Benjamin Dom, Norberto Ferreira, and Isidoro Beck for their efforts ever since they founded this space of Return to Lacan. We are going through a very painful pandemic that is a scourge for humanity. It's a real that is difficult to imagine or represent in words and poetry and interpolate this all the time. In the Spanish pandemic, many years ago, Sophie, Freud's daughter, died, and Freud wrote to Jones saying, "You know what has happened to me losing my daughter. It's absolutely depressing and an unforgettable loss." But Freud continues, life and work must continue as long as we are alive. And here we are working with desire, with technical resources to hold our meeting. It's a new bet on supporting the value of the word and sourcing in essential uh, notions to transmit what we do, to convey what we do. Our meeting is just one more meeting in our work, but I like to put it or bring it together. The idea of bringing it to colleagues all over the world. In the book After Babel, George Steiner said that men were wanted to reach the heaven, and creating different languages was not punishment, but rather for Steiner, a mysterious, immense definition. So now, today, with our different languages and wishing to all of us an excellent meeting, showing otherness and differences in our social bonds, I welcome our colleagues from inland Argentina and from many other lands, Uruguay, Chile, Spain, US, Brazil, Mexico, and I'm sure I'm forgetting someone. But still, and now I will introduce each one of the speakers to the extent that, or as they start speaking. And I invite you all to write your comments or questions in the Zoom chat. We will try to answer some of them. And as Diego said before, some others will have to be responded by email later on. Thank you very much. The floor now to Benjamin Dom. Let me introduce you, Benjamin. He is a founding member of the Freudian School of Buenos Aires. He's an analyst and a member of the school. For 20 years, he presented patients in the Borda hospital. He has authored different books, Beyond the Phallus, Enjoyment, Is it a suffering or an enjoyment? And he practices in Buenos Aires, where he also is delivering his seminar. Benjamin, the floor is yours. Good morning again. I am with you once more, and I will take just 1 minute of my allocated time because I have an inquiry regarding the previous panel. Just sometimes we talk about the analyst, and the analyst is the analyst in the practice, not the analyst walking in the street or the analyst who may be part of the mass. Today, he may be an analysand, he himself, because he may have an ideology or whatever. So the analyst has to be careful not to mix things up. The analyst is an analyst in his practice with his patients. And then he's an analysand, as Lacan was saying or said when he delivered his seminars. All right. And now to my presentation today. I just wanted to make that comment. Some of the questions in the presentation, I need to remind you that since 2014, we've been working on this return to Lacan ever since we learned that psychoanalysis was being conveyed in a way that seemed going backwards for us, in the same way as for us, what happened specifically with post-Freudians, they also went backwards. They were removed from the unconscious and psychoanalysis, and they created schools that pushed Lacan to talk about the need to return to Lacan, to Freud, and now we talk about a return to Lacan. Let me pose some of the questions. For example, Lacan says that psychoanalysis, ever since it exists, has changed. How to interpret this? And I say it will go on changing. And somehow we should not fear these changes, other than when changes fall outside the realm of psychoanalysis. How has psychoanalysis changed? It changed in Freud himself. Just a quick overview. Freud discovered the unconscious, working on dreams and their interpretation, and somehow he found the first topic, unconscious, conscious, preconscious. Uh, Years go by, Freud's works are very rich. I'm abridging this here, but after talking about drives, etc., he comes to beyond the pleasure principle. After beyond the present, the principle, he changes. He produces a second topic, the id, the ego, and the superego. This second topic deletes what he did before. Some people got confused and they thought that the id is the unconscious. No, it's both the id and the unconscious. There's two sides to it. Lacan has clearly described them. Differentiating the id and the unconscious. The unconscious is still present. Drive, it won't be confused with castration or repression. Can't be so. The second topic, again, let me repeat, does not delete the first, and that's why Lacan has talked about returning to Freud, returning to psychoanalysis proper. I do not wish to dwell on this, simply tell you that Lacan rescues Freud's work, rescues him, essentially the unconscious, and Lacan reformulated the unconscious, so much so that he enriched it and transformed it into discourse. And in Seminar 20, just by way of an example so that you can understand this, Lacan says in his last lesson that the unconscious is witnesses to knowledge because it escapes the being. This unconscious knowledge allows to realize up to where the language may have an effect. You know that language and speech are different for for Lacan, and I won't dwell on this because I'm short of time. But afterwards, Lacan started discussing or arguing with Freud, but it's an enriching argument. It does not delete what Freud discovered. At a certain point in time, he said, I mentioned this at the beginning of my presentation, Lacan said that the unconscious belongs with Lacan. The field is Freud's. And later on in his process of change, Lacan will say the real is my symptomatic response to the Freudian lucubration of the unconscious, the speculation of the unconscious. This is progress, not deletion of Freud. There's an answer to Freudian speculation or lucubration on the unconscious. From the very beginning, Lacan has talked of real, symbolic, and imaginary, the three. And he has developed systematically his theorizing that keeps changing. Uh, there's a new change. Lacan, from the very beginning all the way to his very last works, changed. And it's very difficult to summarize these changes. Let me talk about some things that Lacan says, and I'm sure I will forget others. For example, the mirror stage that Annabelle mentioned. The mirror stage is a reformulation of Freud's narcissism, said in a different way, because as I say, there's changes, there's enrichment. The notion of the capital other, the big other, is a notion introduced by Lacan. And what will he say later on? That the other doesn't exist. Progress, things to be developed. Lacan also talked about the unconscious structured as a language. That's reformulating the unconscious. He talks about the difference between signifier and letter. So, and then October 9, he reformulates the question of the end termination of analysis. This is 1967. And then he went on talking about the end of analysis until the 80s. Psychoanalysis changes. It has changed ever since it exists. And it will go on changing if we are capable of creating and developing what Lacan produced. But creating, recreating in Lacan does not mean eliminating the unconscious. It is not eliminating the bases that supports psychoanalysis. What psychoanalysis is properly. Lacan also responds the question, Freud's question on what does a woman want, and he makes a clear-cut distinction between mother and woman. We should bear this in mind. And he talks about the logic of not all and a new ground for psychoanalysis. He says there is no sexual relation. And this, for me, is essential to understand many things. He casts light. He says this no sexual relation casts light on a field that allows us to think of sexual diversity, something that is so much up to date. There's no sexual relation implies saying that there's the movements today, lesbian, gay, trans, etc., TBG, and why do they exist? If there is no sexual relation in the speaking being, then sexual encounters of all sorts take place in the search for finding, for there being a sexual relation. And Lacan has also said that sex is said. It's not anatomy. This is essential. It has much relevance that sex has to do with the word. Sex is spoken, and each may place him or herself at any place they like. In the latest seminars, he talks about the Borromean knot, where he finally ties up three heterogeneous registers, absolutely heterogeneous, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. And that's what we are made of. These three things that are quite different one from the other. That's why the subject is so complex. You cannot mix up symbolic with real or with imaginary. It's three heterogeneous registers that make up our complexity. Now, should we stay at Lacan and make no progress by just repeating what Lacan said? No, this is no dogma. This is not a dogma. It's not dogmatic. I need to remind you that Lacan said, do as I do not imitate me. So, if we wonder about these purported disciples of Lacan, why they let their patients go after 2, 3, 5 minutes and they answer, it's because Lacan did. This is identification with the analyst, and Lacan got tired of trying to differentiate himself, and the analytic differentiation may be a stage of the analysis, but not the conclusion of the analysis. It is not mandatory to do what Lacan did, and it is necessary to listen to our patients more than 2, 3, 5 minutes if it's necessary. Well, you have just 3 minutes. Okay, so I will say uh, something that Lacan mentioned in Lansu, his seminar Lansu. He talks about psychoanalysis and counter psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, Lacan says, is the development of the word and everything that has to do with the subject structure. And that is what he calls psychoanalysis. But he says, because of the graph of desire and things that I won't dwell in, we need to, he said, talk about what he called counter psychoanalysis. It's not a good piece of terminology, same as countertransference. I disagree. There is no counter psychoanalysis, I would argue, with Lacan. The psychoanalysis produced by Lacan implies the real, symbolic, and imaginary all tied up, all knotted up. And if we talk of psychoanalysis and counter psychoanalysis, we're making a difference. But Lacan recognized right there and then that psychoanalysis is the structure of the word, of the unconscious, and of the real, and of the imaginary. And I need to come to an end. Thank you. Yes, we will have time for the questions later on. So thank you very much, Benjamin. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Norberto Ferreira, a psychoanalyst, an analyst, a member and founder of the Freudian School of Argentina in 1974. He is co-founder and president or chair of the foundation of the Lacanian field since 1991. So Norberto, the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself. I'm unmuted. Good, yes. Thank you, Graciela. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are located, or even good evening, maybe in Europe. I'll be very brief. Today, I thought of a title for my presentation. It's a bit tricky because I don't agree with myself, not altogether. But I will say I have inspired myself in Maimonides, who wrote a guide for the desperate. You know, Maimonides uh, has been cited by Lacan in connection with a book called The Persecution in the Art of Writing. So, along these lines, I think that there's this guide for the desperate of how making something go away in connection with MLAs. So, my title is A Brief Guide for Those in Love with Psychoanalysis. Of course, this being in love may be useful and it's necessary. But we need to say, and this is something that we see very clearly in our society, that hatred also conveys, and sometimes even more effectively than love. But psychoanalysis has a function of making this hatred not become. um uh, uh, become love. And this is an essential matter of psychoanalysis. Man is a wolf of man, and we need to decrease this in psychoanalysis. This is the essential function of analysis and psychoanalysis in any society, diminishing or lowering destruction by hatred. Okay, back to my point. What is this short or brief guide for uh, lovers of psychoanalysis? It has to do with the history of psychoanalysis. But also, I need to say, what does psychoanalysis discover? Something very simple. What happens when somebody opens up to another who is a listener? There's, of course, the Palo Alto school, semiotics, etc., but never uh, has a discourse other than Freud's to set the basis for how this happens. To have a place where somebody will go to talk to another who will be listening to this somebody, accepting that position of analyst. There's intellectual basis for this, but this discord discourse exists since Freud, with Freud, and with all of Lacan and Lacan's followers. This occurs in the unconscious, and Lacan has introduced a level that was absent before, like in those dreams that we have. Um, with with architecture, when you dream that you are home or a well-known house and there's always a room that you don't know, Freud talks about or says that this is the dimension of the unconscious. Freud discovers the unconscious and its function, places Lacan places the dimension of the word in this, transforming it into discourse. What does this mean? Transforming into discourse, apart from the most important contributions. This is the dimension added explicitly by Lacan to psychoanalysis. And let us not um, forget about this. In seminar 19, they say the social bond is the most important, we could say, because we live and eat and survive with it. But I think it's the most important because it allows speaking. The invariance produced when one wants to speak is constitutes psychoanalysis, and as analysts we have to convey this, falling in love with psychoanalysis or not, but this needs to be conveyed. It's accepted that we talk about it, but what we say is not really accepted many times. So Freud creates the unconscious. Lacan talks about the social bond. This social bond has some more than important characteristics. As Benjamin was saying, one, it's because it creates the unvariance or invariance that makes a makeup analysis. And the other thing is that it supports a fundamental interrogation, the development of that conversation or that social bond itself, which will contribute to undo by transference, for example, the conditions that were up for that to happen. So there is no discourse that with its own elements could work in order to find a dissolution or termination or transference of that social bond that is the analysis. No discourse can do this for its own pleasure. One thing is to destroy it, and a different thing is to finish it, put it to an end, etc., which is dissolution. And apart from this, there's something that is essential. We have talked about this many times, the subversion of the subject. But this subversion of the subject, it has solidarity and is accompanied by this subversion that happens in the social bond of psychoanalysis. There's no other place where this subversion can take place and be accompanied, be solidarious, hand in hand, go hand in hand with transference. It's a necessary subversion for this discourse. And maybe because of this, and I come to realize, it hit me now. Um, Maybe it's the subversion that made me think of my title, because maybe psychoanalysis happens in between the lines. It happens in things that at times where it should not be happening. And sometimes there are those who hate psychoanalysis, and thanks to their hate, psychoanalysis also happens because we think that we can do something about that hatred. And thus, psychoanalysis keeps going. Now, what is the function of the analyst in this concern, in this aspect? We have heard different things in our meeting, but I think that the function of the analyst is essentially making present the time for talking of each analyst. And when I say the time for talking, I mean becoming subject with what he says at a unique time because it's individual. That is, using time as a variable in the session, as a fourth condition in this sense, Lacan says, because each time is individual. Each one will obtain from analysis an individual time to say things, as Lacan says in many ways. Norberto? Time. You have 3 more minutes. You're talking of time. Okay, simply this. There is a future for psychoanalysis? Yes, there is. So long as there is an analytical act all the time. The analytical act is always in the present time. It's present. One more thing, something that I think is very important and we lose sight of it sometimes. If there's institutions and schools, there are also independent analysts who take from those schools. But the analytical act is present, and there has to be an analytical act before the foundation of each school. That is, we need a dimension of the analytical act, not only for psychoanalysis to survive, but also to make it survive in each one of us who have the courage and intellectual honesty to practice exactly the way we do. That is the future of psychoanalysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we will listen to Isidoro Beg. Isidoro, please unmute yourself. A small detail, Graciela. We had agreed it was 15 to 20 minutes, not just 15 minutes. Okay. Very well.
Gracias, Isidoro.
Thank you, Isidora.
Bueno, voy a presentarles a Isidoro Bej.
Let me introduce Isidoro Bej, founder of the Freudian School of Buenos Aires, where he teaches seminars and has been doing it since 1974. He's given courses, seminars, and conferences in different cities in the country and abroad, and he has authored a number of books, among them The Interventions of the Analyst, Return to Lacan, and The Clinic of the Subject. Isidoro, you have the floor. Thank you, Graciela, very much. It is a pleasure to me to share with those who have allocated their time to reflect and work together on what the title invites us to think of and asks us about it. We've listened to a number of papers by the colleagues before me, which helps me deploy what I want to share with you. We said 21st century validity of psychoanalysis. What does it consist in? It is with that title that again we call you to this series that started as Return to Lacan from Buenos Aires, 21st century. The millennium does surprise us. It is the fifth stretch of the century. And we approach this question because it was unthinkable a few years ago. Who of us circulates today or walks without a mobile, without using social media, all exposed, also making use of real-time information. Also enjoy the dissemination of knowledge, which at times is nice and comfortable, but that is overwhelming and forceful, such as Umberto Eco said, rather than looking in despair for that which we are missing, to decide how we would select what is valuable to leave aside that takes us away from our path. Erotism that breaks with the limits between what is private and public. In Facebook, how many times we see teenagers that show their intimacy, something that was unthinkable some time before. We are told that pornography uses 25% of what is in the internet. We know also that no technologies serve the purposes of social and political mobilizations that use the webs and force certain governments to apply censorship. These phenomena are not old. They are like 10, 15 years old as maximum. So we are facing a new revolution out of the industrial revolution, because such as in the frog's tale, it's hard for us to realize we are already in the pan. Robotics that is expanding at an unthinkable speed will change labor relationships, such as Roberto and my colleagues have said, and so the other relations of the social bond, making millions and millions of jobs to be phased out, things we were used to, and the new ones are created with new asymmetries, and those can locate in these new technologies, and those who are not, changes that have an impact on our body, nanotechnology, genetic modifications. We cannot do writing such as I was told before. There's just one mother. Now we have the one that conceives, the one that is involved in the gestation, the one that is involved in the breathing. So is still psychoanalysis valid, or has it phased out because it dates from old times? Or on the contrary, psychoanalysis is something that these times are claiming for more and more. At the back of the decree written in the 60s, Lacan used to say that psychoanalysis registered itself in the tradition of the light. Illuminism, which drove the French Revolution, had an inaugural position of political liberalism, where the claims of that revolutionary time, which installed a new class in power, used to say liberté, égalité, fraternité. Karl Marx said, we should not fight these flags of the bourgeois. We have to demand that they abide by them. Lacan says that psychoanalysis is a part of this tradition that takes God out of the center of the universe, proposing a new obscurantism when brings men to a throne, identified to the self as the one organizing and deciding on what we will call their world. It is to that self that a psychoanalysis has inflicted, such as Freud said, its third wound when he said that par l'être, the human living, conditioned by speech, does not know what he says or does. There is an unconscious reason, a knowledge that does not appear on the screen of conscience and which essentially decides on each of these movements. So I ask myself, what do we offer from psychoanalysis in the light of what the century puts forward? So, in the social field, there are people who dream of a world where artificial intelligence would build a thoughtless world. There are some people who write that in a short time, depression therapy will not be required anymore because a chemical formulation will be found that finally sorts it out. What do we as psychoanalysts have to say in the light of these changes, which of course have many beneficial effects, but also aim at the annihilation of the subject? What subject? That subject of the speech, the subject of desire. From psychoanalysis, we consider this valid, such as a claim for it from ethics. I I remember what Michel Foucault, with whom many times we agree and many others disagree, uh, highlighted as microphysics of power. According to Michel Foucault, it would not be after the failed propositions brought together with Nazism, a new world that would last 1,000 years, or with Stalinism, a new man of which we have seen the results of the conquest of the government, of the state. But applauding the intellectual who, as an omniscient figure, looks at the world from above and sends benefactory prescriptions. What is proposed, and if I say so, it's because I'm putting this forward, is for each one of us in the environment we choose to offer our own responses to the incidences in the century we are going through, to which try to overwhelm the subject in our field, such as we do with the colleagues here and others that are involved in the same, accept to give responses to the different manifestations that once again try to draw the efficiency of unconscious reason, which allows that we go from the individual to a divided subject that can admit the difference between what he or she says and what he or she knows. And these claims for answers in three different fields, which I'm going to attempt to give response to. In the field of psychoanalysis, that's why I returned to Lacan, we find ourselves again with a partial underlining of the works of the master, which makes theory poorer, such as he himself said in his seminar Anguish. He himself had to face in the 50s with his return to Freud, to the ego psychology, which proposed returning to conscious under the motto of a self free from conflict, of unconscious efficacy, available for the adaptation that at the time claimed the social bond in the new country of adoption. He had gone to the United States fleeing from Nazism. Today, we find in those who say they owe to Lacan's work the prevalence of the real against the symbolic, a real that rapidly degrades into reality with its imaginary value. How do we respond from our field where we acknowledge that our object is subject, a triadic subject where one is three and three is one, such as the Borromean knot, the latest title by Lacan, the symbolic and the real? We answer by saying, yes, it's okay. It is true that there are manifestations in subjects in the way they speak, they act, they feel, they think, that do not respond to the logic of the unconscious as a logic of the incompleteness. In the light of that, I respond with a flow diagram, with a writing where I conjugate the first writing by Lacan, the graphs with the theme, with the last writing by Lacan, nodal writing. I don't have time to deal with this in detail, but you can look at this in the path of analysis, a book of mine, of the clinic of subject. In that flow diagram, we look at the temptations of the id or the mandates of the superego. There are mandates that go through the screen of the unconscious, and they become propitiating ideals, or they go from unlimited temptation to drives linked to desire, which support the jouissance that makes life good. But doing away with all the rest, I can also say that it's also true that there are temptations and mandates that will never go and have never gone through the unconscious screen, and they require another type of intervention. That is why a few years ago I proposed the analyst not just to intervene with a classical symbolic interpretation, but also from the real and the imaginary, to the extent he or she always aims at his or her real target. An action to release the subject from his or her fixation to a parasite jouissance. This is not a new category of morally good or bad jouissance. I call parasite jouissance to the enjoyment which is between the subject and his or her desire, such as Lacan said when he proposed the fourth ring, which he called Saint Tom, when he worked with Joyce's Life and Works, the creation of channels in the real where the symbolic cannot tie the structure very well, where for the enjoyment of mandates and temptations that will never go through the screen of the unconscious to channel into an acceptable, creative, inventive world in the social bond. A second front attempt to respond. Beyond psychoanalysis and the psychoanalyst to which we respond, we have once again, and how many there have been, those who say we do have an answer to what psychoanalysis cannot resolve. Today, in the media and with the support of government, there is the cognitivism. If someone asked me, Dr. Baig, do you think that cognitivism can be of help? I can say yes, undoubtedly. The problem is that it will be temporary. It is once again psychotherapy focused on conscience. Um, I may be asked, but how come if they're talking about unconscious? That's true. But what they call unconscious is what, since Freud, we've been calling pre-conscious. They are unaware of the structure and the laws of the Freudian unconscious and the logic that lives in that unconscious, and to which Lacan dedicated his life and teachings. And again, this is associated to what is social. Today we have the DSM, the statistic manual that proposes an attempt to classify the ailments that are called disorders in the field that we walk in the C of psi field to set a limit to that was even publicly reported by the Institute of Mental Health of the United States, when they found that two of those who wrote the DSM were paid by the big pharma to invent new ailments and obtain new profit by manufacturing new drugs. To respond to this DSM that wants to standardize subjects, making them just an individual, it is that I suggest a distinction. On the one hand, we have classical in psychoanalysis, structural diagnosis, which psychoanalysts are used to, neurosis, prevention, psychosis, and in neurosis, hysteria, obsessive neurosis, and phobia. But to this structural diagnosis, I would suggest to add a primary fixation diagnosis founded in those traces which from the id and the superego will never go through the screen of the unconscious as a fixation of jouissance. And this primary fixation diagnosis will with time bring cure. And I would call it a non-standardizable mode, or setting a limit to the attempt to use technology to get the diagnosis for the subject. Let me give you an example. The Wolfman, a classic story brought by Freud, says he didn't have any doubt his dominant structural diagnosis was obsessive diagnosis, but with perverse traces. Its erotic condition was a crouching woman seen from the back. There were visual hallucinations and persecutory delusions, with foreclusive defense prevailing. The impact of these primary fixation traces, the Wolfman tried to limit them by painting. Unfortunately, we know that there were overwhelming eruptions of what is real, and success was precarious. Microphysics of power invites us to respond from our field a way to support its validity in what our time is claiming for us. Today, more than ever, psychoanalysis holds ethics that match the values of that great Dutch thinker called Baruch Spinoza, who brings from his writings, his time, his ethics, when he says the essence of man is desire. And desire reminds us that human being is a sign rather than a burden, a being that is realized by movement. We aimed from psychoanalysis to releasing the subject from the places where he is retained with guilt, and to let them go to their realization according to the marks traced by his desire. Thank you very much. Isidoro, thank you so much. My apologies for the previous. We are analysts. Norberto, I'm so sorry because I may have interrupted 1 minute before. Unfortunately, again, my apologies. There are many questions, very interesting, all of them. Norberto, I'm going to start with questions for you, and then if you want to move on a bit. And let me read the questions. If you want to use more time, please be my guest.
A mí también me sacaste minutos, ¿eh?
You've also taken minutes off me. I'm told I gave you 20 precisely.
I am being told
but we also have
that
questions
I gave you
for
exactly
you,
20. So we have questions also for you. So no need to be jealous. We will also ask. Norberto, there's interesting question. Albas Lessler, can you tell us about the difference between making room to discourse as a social tide or bond in analysis, and then talk about what's social in the analysis? Several people are asking, Norberto, about the analytical act, which you mentioned. And they are asking about the relationship it has with founding a school. And then Veronica Cohen asks about the value you assign to love. Does it go beyond what's dual? Is it in civilization? Is jouissance in civilization? I'm asking also about hatred and destruction. Is there a necessary hatred that separates from the death drive? Let me answer the three of them right away.
El mal ya estaba hecho, pero bueno, está bien. La diferencia entre lo social y el análisis del lazo social es una diferencia que se puede hacer, pero es muy especulativa.
Regarding a social bond, whatever answer would be speculative. Psychoanalysis is the most social discourse that exists, from Freud, from certain Marxists. Psychoanalysis was criticized for being asocial. So discourse is asocial, and it's asocial because it's associated to the very practice of psychoanalysis. So if we can say that this dimension prioritized by Lacan, the dimension of the subject, is only possible in the social bond. It's not a condition one for the other. They come hand in hand. This has to do with the analytical act. Why did I say that it is unique? It's single and it's present, and it's an act where the analyst subtracts himself from the presence there, for being present there as a subject. In connection with love, there's something that is necessary, because if you don't hate, you cannot separate, not even from yourself. This hatred is necessary. But a different thing is destruction, when we clearly see that. And this is why I was saying that in connection with analysis, there's a dissolution that is the solution for transference. And a different thing, but destruction is a different thing, because destruction implies annihilation. If you're a Nazi, you may be a Nazi in many ways. Now, when analysts who call themselves analysts, we may see this, and also when the analyst does what he knows how to do for the analysis, but he has to be very careful not to steal knowledge from the analysis. This is one of the most important things to bear in mind, so as not to pervert the analytical act. Thank you, Norberto. Benjamin, could you say something else? Liliana Donsis asks, and there's others asking about the same, real and the unconscious. And do you think that RSI is a conclusive moment of Lacanian thought? And there's more questions about the counter-analysis. So you may take either one of these topics to expand on. Well, first of all, thank you for the questions. Let me say the following, because no doubt I could get started by saying that real unconscious are disjuncted somehow, although they are tied up also. The unconscious speaks. Because it goes back to repression, because it talks all the time, it speaks all the time, and because the unconscious is a knowledge, an unknown knowledge, but which somehow determines behaviors in the subject, attitudes. So the unconscious essentially speaks and is discourse, as Norberto was saying, whereas the real is mute. And it's also present in the subject, but it's mute. As Lacan said, there's no sexual relation, woman doesn't exist, etc., etc. But these are questions where we are included. That is, the real is also contingent. It's what happens, what uh, is not for sure, and it's also present. We may say that this and that subject met this and that woman in this and that or that circumstance, and they established a story, but the encounter is contingent. After the encounter, there are transferences, yes, and it so happens that that woman or man that you met are, have to do with your father, your mother, and that is something that is related to the encounter. Maybe the difference there that we should make is between truth and real. Truth goes half said, and there's a truth that is not said, but the real is always present constantly in our lives. This meeting is real. It's also symbolic and imaginary, but it's happening right here and now in the present, and therefore it exists. And if it exists, it's real. Tomorrow, when we talk about this meeting, it will be something that has to do with the word. And there is something real in what is going on. Each analytical session is real, but in between those sessions real, there's discourse, there's words, and there's somehow the imaginary. No doubt, because the imaginary is there, the phantom is there. And I think that for Lacan, what I'm going to say was determining. His development, that is, first he talked about the difference between imaginary and symbolic in the very first seminars, and then he vindicated or he brought up again the real, saying that it's a response to the object A and differentiating object A from the real at a point in time. So, of course, there's an open field because Lacan didn't say everything, all. Uh, the field is open and we can keep making progress. And in order to wind up, I'd like to mention the business of counter psychoanalysis. I think Lacan's choice of words is not great because there's people who remain stuck in counter psychoanalysis, which is the contrary of psychoanalysis. Lacan said, undoing with the word what was done with the word. Yes, the counter psychoanalysis then would be like saying re-establishing the not, but the not, KNOT, is re-established constantly, I believe. Of course, there's people who leave the analysis and refer everything to their unconscious and what they talked about in the session, but the real is always present in each act. When you take the elevator, when you go out into the street. So Lacan theorized up to that point. But what we should not do, I think, is taking up this position of talking of counter psychoanalysis and psychoanalysis, because we end up on top of the counter psychoanalysis, and analysis has to support the three in any way possible, so that each subject may support his real, the real that he has, because the real is not necessarily mine, his real is not mine. And now we are faced with a pandemic and we go through it any way we can, each differently. Before telling Isidoro the question he received, I don't know, Norberto, if you wish to say something else, because I cut you before. And let me talk about Adriana Caselas' question on invariance in the social bond. And Adriana Heckman, he talks about is it a future is possible for a different social bond based on analysis. Yes, there was a question that I was told somebody posed. Somebody understood that I said that the institution or the school comes before the act. No, I didn't say that. There are acts that are only possible if there is an institution or a school. That is what I said. The person who said that understood wrongly, got me wrong. As to invariance, I'm not talking of the social only. I know the invariance of social in analysis because the society has invariants to talk, and those are the ones to be discovered by psychoanalysis. But to perform our practice, all of that is worked in transference. Transference allows us not to invent things that never happen in transference and allows us not to leave psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis takes place in the transference. And in this sense, I can explain my title in a complicated way because it's too personal. But what I said is guides for those in love with psychoanalysis. I thank you for your questions. And this is an answer for Veronica Cohn. Thank you, Graciela. Until we meet again. I don't know when. No, there's the management of the future. The future doesn't exist. Only the present exists that may make a certain future. But what happens in analysis, I don't know. To each his own. I never want to talk about whether analyzing yourself is better or worse. But if you analyze yourself, you obtain something that otherwise you wouldn't obtain. Thank you, Norberto. Isidoro, there's many questions. For example, Liliana Donsis, she asks about parasite enjoyment and word. Enrique Ratin asks about the difference of interventions in the real and from the real. Alba Flessler asks whether you could say something else about analyst interventions in connection with primary fixation, continuous jouissance without distribution, different from fixation with secondary regression. And Maria Marta Casanova asks, what about super egoic mandates would move on or pass on to the unconscious? Can you dwell or expand a little bit on these concepts? First, I would like to thank you for the different questions. In connection with parasite enjoyment, as I said, that is a term used by Lacan in his own way. He talks about bringing together the unconscious and the imaginary. We are bringing together the symptom and the real parasite of the enjoyment, inhabiting it. So parasite jouissance means a jouissance that makes it impossible for the subject to gain access to his desire and leaves him just repeating what we call the same. The same. In connection with interventions in the real or from the real, they are in the real interventions or in the imaginary, which of course require analyst knowledge. Somebody said, I never wanted to be original. I just wanted to build, Lacan said, I want to build logic into Freudian narrations. So we need to percourse the logic of the structure, because when Lacan talked about the unconscious and logic, some people believe that now we can do without Freud's discovery, because talks about Freudian slips and jokes and other creations of the unconscious. But in the next seminar, he went on talking about the unconscious. So he never left it behind. It's the unconscious knotted to the imaginary and the real. This is what he meant. And this is what Benjamin was saying. In the analysis, we try to help the analysand who made a regression. Alba, this is for you. May recover that place that is called castration for Freud, or re-encountering the lack, as Falafia said, re-encountering the lack, meeting again the lack, which is the paradox of psychoanalysis, where we teach our analysants that there are losses that are gains. Absolutely. So losing those parasite enjoyments, it's a gain for the subject realization. And I insist, if we talk of primary fixations, those that never went through the screen of the unconscious, and which not necessarily happens in severe cases, like the man in the wolves and obsessive neurosis. At the beginning, he talked about psychosis, but it's neurosis. In neurotics, we find places in the unconscious network that never went through the castration. Sometimes I'm asked, the symptom that Lacan worked a lot in connection with Joyce, James Joyce. Now, symptom, is it just necessary for psychosis? What about neurosis? And my answer is symptom is a channeling of enjoyment in the real, and you cannot do without it in psychosis, and it's preferable in neurosis, as I say sometimes with an example for my students. Perhaps many of you who are listening now, and each one of the colleagues with whom I'm talking now, perhaps psychoanalysis doesn't work as symptom, or is it a place where we can channel enjoyment, an enjoyment that would ruin our lives otherwise? Well, this much is what I can say about the questions that were posed. Thank you. One last question. It's for Benjamin Dom. Can you find a connection between no sexual rapport with the recognition of self-perceived identity? And a clarification from Liliana Donsis. She would like to know the difference between parasite enjoyment and parasite word. Isidoro. Okay, Benjamin. You were saying no sexual relation and? What's the comparison? No sexual relation and? Would you find any connection between there being no sexual rapport or relation with the recognition of self-perceived identity? Ms. Lescano posed this question. Self-perceived identity, to be honest, I'm beginning to understand the question, because it's, in any case, it may be an answer. The self-perceived identity is an answer to this there not being sexual relation, and each one responds any way they can. It's sexual identity. I think I have to bring this in. Each one's sexual identity, self-perceived. I don't know if there's a self-perception, or rather a decision regarding an identity that each one identifies as each one identifies. That is, if there is no sexual relation, no doubt we can invent an identity of some kind. And then one will perceive oneself any way one likes. But remember that there's phantoms that respond to this. There is no sexual relation, and therefore anyone may have a determining phantom, determining one's identity. So saying there's no sexual relation means that one may call oneself a man, woman, or pansexual, but the sexual identity as self-perceived uh, is acceptable. It depends on each one. Why does one person perceive himself in this or that fashion? But this, there not being sexual relation allows um, a broad scope of perception. Each one will be responsible for what each one chooses. Silvia Vansten, Isidoro, says, thank you for your speech. There's very many thanks and congratulations for each one of the speakers and for the coordination of the event. Well, but I'm only concentrating on questions. Silvia Weinstein says, thank you, Isidoro, for your speech. Do you think that artificial intelligence as one of the new apparatus offered by technology affirms and gives consistence to parasite enjoyment? And then from Brazil, Shirley Cesarino for Isidoro, a comment in Portuguese. Some governments censor the internet. Others use it with hypnotic strategies in order to attain the same objectives as the ones who censor it. Isidoro? What Shirley says, we can answer at the same time as Liliana Donce's question about enjoyment and word as parasites. Lacan says, la parole peut être, le mot peut être a deceit or deceitful, but not always. And at the latest seminars, and I think Benjamin said this, he says that psychoanalysis undoes with the word what was done by the word. So that's the parasite word. If I use our current terminology, Rui had a reference to Newtonian physics and chemistry. Freud had. Now Lacan has um, structuralism in mind. But I will refer to what we say nowadays, information technology. The threaded word in information technology uses the word virus. It's a medical term. When I say that the subject is structured by the word of the other, or when Lacan says there's no other, he means there's no complete other, because nobody was born by self management. And that is a virus that has been wrongly threaded, and it leaves the subject as a prisoner within a mandate that he cannot release himself from. Or it may be a mandate articulated with an egoic mandate, a homeostasis you cannot renounce. It's like the mother who tells the child, don't leave your job in the bank because for sure you will get a pension from that. So, talking about our information technology these days, symbolic interpretation is like an antivirus. It's the creation of a program that undoes the program that left the person, the subject, all intertwined in his situation. Now, what about parasite enjoyment? When somebody as intelligent as Noah Harari, who has a complacent reading of our present days, in one of the last chapters, Harari says, with psycho drugs, no more therapy will be needed. for depression. There will be a drug that will solve the problem because chemically that is solved. And I say that is an illusion or a delusion because it's like saying that IA may govern our societies and that would eliminate human errors. That's an illusion, it's a phantom. Unfortunately, in certain partial fields, there are people trying to put them to work. We all suffer from the new structures in medical care, in health care, because in the social bond, nowadays, those physicians who have a calling, an authentic calling for helping and favoring health, physicians are so limited in their time availability that they cannot take care of patients in the way they are supposed to by training. So the idea is using IT to eliminate the conversation with the patient. I was talking to a family physician about this. When I diagnose non-standardizable primary fixation, I'm trying to put a non-real limit to the diagnosis in the DSM. And that's it. Thank you very much. Now we close this panel. There are, as I said, lots of thanks and congratulations, Norberto. They are very thankful for your having included transference and for the way you speak, the power in your words. Also, Isidoro, thanks for keeping up this space. Many questions, many more questions, and I'm being told that you can send your comments and questions to um, uh, Buenos Aires Return to Lacan. We will write it for you. And well, you may pose your questions there. There are many things still left unsaid to be approached. So Isidoro, they have asked me to uh, wrap up our session. Number one, I will thank the panel coordinators, my colleagues as well. Each one participated with their own reflections. The technical team, thank you too, because thanks to them, we have been able to hold this meeting despite the pandemic, and especially my thanks to each one of you in your different languages and geographies got ready to keep us company in our reflections and with your questions and with your comments also. Briefly, and having come to the end of this meeting, I would like to say that our attempt once more time, as Ferreira was saying, let us not get crazy about the invariance offered by psychoanalysis to transference. But from the transference itself, from psychoanalysis, what we try to do without losing specificity is try to say something so that psychoanalysis can keep its connection with the horizon of our day. This is what we are attempting to do. And thank you very much, each one of you. And we might say that the future is not present, but we can anticipate it, at least in our desire. And so I will say, see you next time around.